So in the last mini lecture, we were in the first part of the media, and we were taking a look at what the media was, that communication device, right? It's a technology set. And we were specifically interested in mass media, so technologies designed to mass communicate information. And we were also taking a look at the press, or the people who have generally used mass communication sources, mass media. And we looked at that trajectory through history, and we looked through some eras of the media. And now what we want to do is start looking at the effects that media has on politics and the political stage. And I think that Doris Graber has summed it up best. It says, media do more than depict the political environment. They are the political environment. In other words, everything that we get, all of our information, comes to us through a lens. And that lens is technology and press. And because of that, this is then the stage that politicians and political institutions have to be thinking about when they want to get through to you, or to me, or to anyone else for that matter. So what's being said here is that politics, modern politics, takes place on the stage that is media. And so this is going to have some important psychological and sociological effects. And so that's what we're going to be taking a look at in this section. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that we've had an explosion of information about the way people think, psychological behavior. And once upon a time, we thought people were relatively rational human beings. And by rational, I don't mean we always did the most optimal thing in the world, but rather we took a look at choices and we made decisions on the basis of our ideas and what we thought. Right? So, if you were liberal, you would, of course, vote for people who would push for liberal policies. Or if you were conservative, you would push for individuals who were pushing conservative policies. But what we actually started to learn was that people don't have actually stable, consistent beliefs. So if you start asking a liberal what they believe about things, there's going to be a whole package of beliefs, and they're not going to necessarily all be consistent. So, well, what do you do with this? Well, the first thing that we kind of took a look at, and by we, I don't mean me personally, but the literature took a look at, and we saw that people did not have what we're going to call high-quality opinions. Now, we don't mean that these are normatively good or bad, but rather what they thought was, or what they did, was linked to what they thought, right? So if I ask somebody, do you think that people should have guns, and you say, yes, I do, then when we had policies that people want to support guns, you'd say, yay, right? That's a high-quality opinion. But what we learned is that these are actually rare. And in fact, when events or issues were presented in slightly different ways, it altered the public opinion. As a matter of fact, tiny changes ended up having huge effects. And so we came up with what's called framing effect. A framing effect is when a small change in the presentation of an issue produces a change of opinion. So, and this actually comes from Druckmann. He says that framing effects are when changes in the presentation of an issue or an event produce, sometimes large, changing of opinion. So this kind of strikes at the whole heart of rational theory, right? Because rational theory says, look, we look at things and we make rational choices based on our preferences. But if our preferences are not fixed, then, well, it's the frame that becomes important more than what anyone thinks. Now, framing inherently impacts political communication because it is a necessary tool of the news media, given the restraints of media to fill airtimes and news holes. So framing effects are huge, and this is one of the first things that we kind of see. And there are four major types of framing effects. There are equivalency frames, there are episodic frames, there are emphasis frames, and there are thematic frames. Let's talk about equivalency first, and then we'll move forward. Equivalency frames is when you have something that involves different but logically equivalent words or phrases to describe the same event or issue, but that those different phrases or words evoke, either intentionally or unintentionally, a different response. So if I say, that I'm scared of rabbits, if you think differently of me than if I say I'm scared of bunnies, then we have an equivalency frame. Because there's no difference between a bunny and a rabbit. That's the same stuff. But if for some reason, my audience, if I say rabbit and they think, that rabbit can hurt you, but they think bunny, oh, cute, cuddly, right? We've had an equivalency frame, right? The next kind of frame is, I want to take a look at three, and this is kind of out of order. Let's take a look at emphasis frame. An emphasis frame highlights a different subset of potentially relevant considerations of an issue out of a larger potential set of considerations for the same issue, right? So here's some potential story, and there's a bunch of facts, right? But we only have 5 minutes, so I have to choose which set am I going to present? And the story could look different depending on what I decide to emphasize, right? Am I emphasizing this or am I emphasizing that? And this is going to matter more the less time you have. So, for example, if you take another political scientist's class in American government, my guess is that there's going to be some differences in the way we present things. We might highlight some things more than other things, but you would come out of the class with basically similar understandings to one another. And you wouldn't think, oh, well, Dr. Warndorf, he's a completely different kind of person than, Dr. Smith or whoever. Now, imagine, though, that you told some other professor and me, look, you've got 3 minutes to explain the essence of political science to your audience. My guess is that, theoretical Dr. Smith and I might have very different answers because we're constrained. We might choose different things to highlight. And people then would walk away with a different understanding of what political science is based on a frame, in this case, the emphasis frame. The next two we want to take a look at are episodic and thematic, and these two are basically different things, I shouldn't want to say opposite sides of the same coin. An episodic frame takes the form of a case study. It is an event-oriented report which depicts public issues in terms of some single concrete instance, right? So if I want to understand poverty, I should interview a individual who is in poverty and take a look at their day-to-day life, look at that one episode, and let it stand for the larger issue. So it's a case study, it's event-oriented. The other possibility is to have a thematic frame, and a thematic frame shoots to put something in abstract or general context. So if I want you to understand about poverty, in this case, I might talk about the total number of people who are impoverished, the economic amount of money you need to be impoverished or not impoverished. What does it mean to be on that line? And to take a look at that kind of macro level picture. And what we see is people relate to these kinds of things very differently. If I put something in abstract context, for instance, you're far more likely to not think of it as being applicable to you because you won't actually draw it down to the concrete case. But on the other hand, if I show you someone who's poor, you will think about the poverty being linked specifically to that person or that type of person, and not apply it more generally or do the necessary math to realize how potentially widespread it is. So we have equivalency frames, emphasis frames, episodic frames, and thematic frames. And frames were the first kind of big, hey, look, here's the way that media presentation can affect us. Now, the next one we're going to take a look at is called agenda setting. Now, agenda setting is the psychological mechanism by which we predict that there will be a correlation between the media's placement of an issue and the audience's placement of an issue. So, for instance, if there's lots of coverage on war, then people will likely cite war as being the most important issue facing the country. As this declines, people's preference for saying that war is important will decline. That's agenda setting, and there's really basically two potential reasons this happens. One is that the things that are most prevalent in your mind are the top, or what we're going to call the top of the head issues, or what's going to pop into your head if I ask you a question. So if you've been hearing about war, and I say, hey, what's an important issue? You're going to think, oh, war, because that's the one that's just kind of floating around there on top. It's the same reason if somebody gives you a list of things, you're most likely to remember the first thing or the last thing. Now, the other possibility that you might see this connection is because people treat journalists as a credible source for judging the importance of events. And they might say to themselves, haha, if journalists are spending, 20 hours a day talking about this war must be the number one topic because journalists are having a big deal. Walter Lippmann put it this way. He said that the press is like a beam of a searchlight that moves restlessly about, bringing one episode and then another out of dark and into vision. And this is all about agenda setting. Now, a lot of people think that the media, the thing that they're really good at, and you'll notice we have not mentioned this and we're not going to mention it because it's not a big impact, is the media has some ideological bias. And that's the thing that's going to kind of seep into your brain. Well, really, what the media is good at is not telling you what to think about. It's telling you how to think, but rather what to think about. As a matter of fact, Cohen, another famous political scientist, in 1963 will say, quote, "The media may not be successful much of the time in telling people what to think, but it is stunningly successful at telling its readers what to think about." So, the topics of the day come to you via the searchlight that is the media. And as a matter of fact, we can kind of see this happen. There's an interesting book called Setting the Agenda. And what we know, what data has shown, is that violent crimes have decreased. Matter of fact, in the 1990s, they decreased precipitously, and that decrease continued into the aughts and the 2000s. However, during that same time, stories and shows about violent crimes have increased. So during the 90s and the aughts, the number of shows and television, crime novels, and all of this kind of stuff, and the stories on the news have increased at an exponential rate. And so what did we end up seeing? Well, we see that people prioritize crime fighting over other things because, well, that has to be important, right? Well, in this case, not so much. In this case, we know that The connection was between the number of stories, not the number of actual crime. So people's opinions weren't linked to what was actually happening on the ground. They were linked to the stories that were going on about what was happening on the ground. This is agenda setting. Now, it doesn't take much of a leap to take us to the next kind of effect that we're going to look at, and that is called priming. Priming is when individuals change the standards by which they evaluate something or someone based on news content, right? So priming is the step forward. So it's not just setting it to be our top-of-the-head thing like the agenda setting, but rather changing the way we evaluate someone. And in this case, I think a picture can paint 1,000 words. Imagine we have two candidates, candidate A and candidate B. and we primarily have just a couple of things that we're interested in. We have one, we're interested in the economic policies of our candidates. And in this case, we see that candidate A has the better econ policy. Another issue we're concerned about is foreign policy. But we think that candidate B has the better foreign policy. So candidate A is presenting our economic package, and candidate B is presenting our foreign policy. Now, let's assume for a minute that we equally weight economics and foreign policy. So, right, we think foreign policy is just important as economic policy, and economic policy is just important as foreign policy. Who then do we choose? Candidate A, or do we choose candidate B? Well, let's kind of see. If priming is correct, and there's evidence to say that it is, then what we would look at is see, okay, what is the media talking about? Well, in this case, let's say that the media is talking a lot about foreign policy. Well, in that case, guess who's going to end up winning? Candidate B. Now, did the media tell us what we should believe about foreign policy? No. Did the media tell us what we should believe about economics? Also, no. But they did prime us to vote on foreign policy, and therefore we picked candidate B. That is the priming effect. Now, if these kinds of things are true, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they are, then what the central feature of the contemporary political system is should be the dominance of the media. And in fact, we see the media dominating. As a matter of fact, it's going to be more important than political parties or interest groups, because it's the thing that frames what you see. And as a result, not only has the study of the press become of central concern, but as we think about other actors competing for political space, press management has been a central concern. Patterson has said, he's a famous political scientist, Patterson argues that the modern campaign environment is actually not a struggle between candidates, but it's a struggle between reporters and candidates. That who you're really kind of running against is journalists. And journalists increasingly speak for politicians because we know, even in the late 1990s, research has shown that presidential candidates only spoke for themselves for about 42 seconds on television. So almost everything else is again coming through that lens. And if this is the case, then we should expect to see programmatic strategies, meaning that campaigns take similar strategies to try to win over and over again. And as a matter of fact, we do in fact see this, and we'll be reading about this. So let's pause our mini lecture here, and this will finish up our second part on the media and politics.